The US and Canada have failed to reach a deal to avert new tariffs planned by President Trump after days of negotiations that went down to the wire. This means 50% US tariffs on a range of Canadian goods will now come into effect. American representatives said Canada had declined to finalise a trade deal and accused Ottawa of, as they put it, continuing its retaliation against the US. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney said progress had not been enough to meet Canadian objectives. He said the US tariffs would be matched dollar for dollar. The US accounts for roughly 70% of Canadian exports. Well, with me now is our correspondent Sean Dilley, and we're hearing there Prime Minister Mark Carney saying they're going to meet these dollar for dollar. This is going to affect both sides, isn't it? This is going to be bad for both sides.
Yeah, it will, but it's extraordinary and not extraordinary. It's shocking and not at all shocking because this is how negotiations happen, particularly where President Trump is concerned. Some people find negotiating techniques frustrating and others say that it's how America achieves what they achieve. But let's take a look just a little bit about what we do know, because the detail of negotiations we don't actually have. We have a good idea that there had been some discussions ongoing about reducing the proposed tariffs in relation to sort of aluminium and steel from Canada, and in exchange the US would get better access to dairy products, and that lots of the provinces in Canada had removed alcohol from their shelves as a retaliatory measure against President Trump. But the context of these talks that have collapsed are that since July, US and Canadian negotiators have been locked in very intense talks after President Trump had said that he would impose 50% tariffs on quite a lot of goods, around 20 billion US dollars, 28 billion Canadian dollars coming into the United States. So yes, I mean, talks have been suspended. Mark Carney had announced at the very 11th hour that he wasn't happy with what he described as last-minute changes to the deal by US negotiators, which he said were unfair, and called into question reliability of what US negotiators had also poked back at Mark Carney, criticising them for not delivering on sort of a promise from the US to give them more preferential terms than any other country.
So in terms of the impact on Americans, it will mean higher prices for consumers and the like. And how will this play out politically?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because we've got two dynamics. The most important point, I mean, Mark Carney hasn't got an awful lot politically to lose at the moment, but President Trump has, because in the run-up to the US midterm elections, where the results of that determine who's in charge of Congress and the Senate, and that's very important for passing legislation. In America at the moment, one of the things Americans find exceptionally frustrating, and I spend quite a bit of time in America, including working in America for the BBC, people find it incredibly frustrating how expensive everything is. And I'll give you a bit of a context on that. We, in other parts of the world, might think, well, Americans are complaining about $5 for a gallon of fuel, but actually that's pretty dynamically increased on what it was. A loaf of bread, $7, $8 in lots of supermarkets. So the concern for an awful lot of voters is going to be that they're going to be, spending more money on those everyday goods. President Trump, meanwhile, talks about America being the hottest country in the world, saying that he's done an awful lot to put the dollars back in taxpayers' pockets by introducing measures, for example, like removing taxation from tips. But there's an even bigger political imperative that does affect Canada, and it affects Mexico as well. Is there are supposed to be trade talks between the United States, Canada and Mexico, looking at that North American sphere generally. Now, Canada has made it really clear that if they couldn't reach a deal on these tariffs, they would not take part in those negotiations. So as at the moment, wine and cement, dairy products and would you believe hockey equipment are subject to these 50% tariffs. Does that mean that this is forever? No, not really. It means that there are going to be more discussions, more talks, and more potential to make a new deal.
OK, thanks very much for now. Sean Dilley, our news correspondent there.